MC Talk, episode 1, with your host, your truly Bret Worley, CEO and founder of MC Nutraceuticals. I have two prestigious guests with me, Bob Hoban and Philip Snow. Bob, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself briefly?
It's good to be here. Thanks for the invitation. My name is Bob Hoban. I'm an attorney in the space for a couple of decades now, and really happy to be here at this point in time when we're talking about the Farm Bill, we're talking about rescheduling, and a number of other things. So it really is an exciting time to be part of this industry.
And Philip Snow, also been an attorney in the industry, not for decades, but for 13 years. And had the pleasure of working with these two fine gentlemen for a while, and excited to be here right now with everything that's going on in the cannabis industry related to hemp, related to rescheduling of marijuana, also what's going to happen in the future as far as we all have a crystal ball to look into it. And looking forward to being here. Thank you.
So the question of the day is, why are we here? Why is the hemp industry where it is today? Bob, you want to get started?
Yeah, Brett, that's a great question. And we were talking a little bit about this morning. The hemp industry is here first and foremost because in 2014 there was the first farm bill passed at the federal level. Based on that, we saw a proliferation of CBD products enter the marketplace. Again, it was debatable whether that was congressional intent to start looking at derivatives from the hemp plant versus a grain and fiber plant. That's neither here nor there because the language said that all derivatives were no longer scheduled. U.S. government doubled down on that in 2018, December of 2018, in fact, when President Trump signed the Farm Bill, which removed research restrictions or limitations from the Farm Bill, and it became a fully commercial enterprise. But why are we here specifically? Because the oversupply of cannabis began as we saw the farmers ramp up production year after year from 2014 to 2015 all the way up to 2020, and that biomass began to accumulate. And Phil, we were just talking about this. What was it about having that biomass laying around and the innovation that came around to it and with it that sort of accelerated the development of consumable products?
That's a great question, and I think back to your point regarding the 2014 Farm Bill, we saw state pilot programs, and in order to be a part of that, there were a number of different barriers to entry for farmers to start cultivating hemp. A lot of those went away once the 2018 Farm Bill passed, and so you started seeing more and more farmers cultivating hemp on much larger scales. In addition to that, you saw hemp be removed from the Federal Controlled Substances Act. And once that happened, you saw a lot of people, starting to play around with it. You mentioned kind of that overabundance of supply, that biomass that existed from that proliferation of farming, and with that biomass that was out there on the market and all of these farmers that were producing it, you also had chemists, people that realistically stayed on the sidelines of the cannabis industry for quite some time due to the illegality of marijuana on the federal level. Those chemists came out to play, so to speak, and with that overabundance of biomass, they had to figure out what to do with that, extensive supply that they had that, quite frankly, was too much to meet market demand. So, with that came innovation, as it related to that biomass, converting some of that biomass into CBD, which was also enjoying a boon in the natural products world at that time, given the abilities for CBD to help people deal with a variety of different ailments. And so with that derivative, cannabidiol, we saw people that were starting to make different things from CBD isolate particularly, and that kind of resulted in this innovation in the cannabinoid space. And I think that resulting innovation has led itself to the proliferation of a number of different products on the marketplace, of which MC Nutraceuticals distributes, around the United States and then internationally as well. And I think Brett would probably be able to speak to, kind of how that has emerged as a large benefit from the 2018 Farm Bill.
But real quick, Brett, I just wanted to just take one more little trip down memory lane in terms of historical importance. What you said is critical here. Beginning in 2014, all derivatives, all compounds compounds, all salts, all isomers, the language is crystal clear. They were removed, not rescheduled, not moved to a different place in the Controlled Substances Act. Those compounds were removed, descheduled from the Controlled Substances Act. And while, as I alluded to at the beginning, maybe Congress didn't foresee compounds for human consumption coming out of the hemp plant as we've seen, what did they do? In around 2016, they passed a regulatory measure. They passed a drug code, which was called a marijuana extract code. That marijuana extract code purported to criminalize all extracts from any cannabis plant. Yet, if it was an extract from the hemp plant, it was legal, and as I mentioned, descheduled. So I and my colleagues at the Hoban Law Group at the time, we went up against the DEA in the Ninth Circuit. And the DEA's position was there's no way that Congress intended for these downstream derivatives to be put into the marketplace when they legalized hemp, when they removed it from the Controlled Substances Act. But the court did interpret the plain language as the plain language is written and said, yes, indeed, these derivatives were contemplated by Congress by express language and that there were no commercial restrictions about producing and selling those. So that's, in effect, how we got here today.
Yeah, and with that, companies like ourselves were able to start identifying new compounds in the plant, and CBN, CBC, THCV, we started to identify these and then find the natural pathway through isomerization to make them at scale. So CBC has to be isomerized to make it at 99% at scale. Same with THCV and Delta 8 and all these other compounds. MC it now sells 46 compounds. So that's where we are today is because of the descheduling, we were able to take, let's say the science started in the 40s with people like Macholan. We were able to go back through 80 years of research that essentially was abandoned due to prohibition and, recreate these things, if you will.
Going back to that definition of hemp under the 2018 Farm Bill, it squarely captures extracts, derivatives, isomers, and cannabinoids, provided they don't exceed 0.3% Delta-9 THC by dry weight. And with that and the intended exemption of tetrahydrocannabinols when found in hemp from the Schedule I controlled substances list, we've seen, all of these different derivatives, these different compounds that have come out that have allowed the marketplace to really thrive, and all of these different applications for these products. Certainly, Bret, you could speak better to this, but I think, all of that language, it was included for very specific reasons, and all of that language has allowed this industry, not only to come into existence, but to also, thrive and flourish based on innovation, based on product development, and based on, people that saw an opportunity, such as MC Nutraceuticals.
Well, you could speculate, going back to the loophole argument, you could speculate it was a loophole, but the reality is it doesn't matter anymore. There's now state law across the country reaffirming hemp-derived products, whether they're, overly regulated, which obviously is not a good thing, or openly regulated, which is we're just pro-business. So that's another reason why we've expedited the science, is because we haven't been limited by onerous tax requirements or being domiciled in one state multiple times over. We can ship out of Denver, Colorado to 30 countries currently. So with that, being able to consolidate an operation, we've been able to expedite the science, given all those things, and then allow the consumer to decide what they actually wanted. Because when you buy a cannabis extract, it's a crapshoot for all intents and purposes. And most of the
And
time,
that started with CBD, to your point.
correct. So most of the time you'll get like 1% THCV, which you might want 20.
But I think it's interesting because, we talk about cannabis, a botanical term, an overarching term. On one hand we have marijuana, on the other hand we have hemp, and that sole distinguishing metric, according to federal law, is that content of Delta-9 THC by dry weight. And one thing that I often explain to people is, the concept of, why can't people get what they need from a marijuana store or a dispensary or, medical and or adult use, whatever it might be. And a useful analogy for that is, walking down the grocery store. If you are forced to buy marijuana, you're only allowed to shop down one aisle of that grocery store. Now, when you are, dealing with the entire market that hemp brings to
The entire
consumer,
cannabis plant.
the entire cannabis plant,
Yeah.
all of the attendant cannabinoids, last I checked, over 120 of them and counting, that grocery store gives you a lot more aisles to shop down.
Correct.
Whatever functional relief you might be after, you're not just forced to shop down one aisle, and I think that that's one of the unique things that hemp offers to the consumers. You're not just forced to buy something that is, very, very high in Delta-9 THC content that's being sold at a state licensed dispensary, for example. You can truly hone in on what it is you want out of that plant or what it is you want out of that product, no different than you would from, any other consumer good.
Well, yeah, and there's the easy use, which I think is another key piece of this is dispensaries of one are only in a certain amount of states, and then you have the medical level, which is, you've got to go see a doctor essentially, right? And then you have rec, which is, you feel like a criminal when you go into a dispensary because, you get ID'd at a glass door, you got to use cash, and I know a lot of those problems have been fixed over the past couple of years, but that's what a consumer thinks that might just want functional relief, as you said. Now, in a lot of states, you can go into a convenience store or a gas station or a normal mode of shopping and get a bag of chips and buy CBN gummies or Delta-8 gummies or Delta-8 vape. And as long as it's restricted to adults, that's really how it should be. I mean, what's the difference? I mean, alcohol's 100 times worse than marijuana. Most people say there's nothing wrong with marijuana. So, when you talk about ease of access and then the variety, that's why the hemp industry's also done so well, is because the consumer market wins. The consumer can get it wherever, whenever, and however they want. And then you also have an online channel, which is, people are lazy nowadays, essentially. Put in your ID to well-known softwares that exist for alcohol, tobacco, etc. It's well-known stuff. I order all my wine online, and it'll be at your door in the next couple of days. So that is why going to an economic portion, that's why the hemp industry has skyrocketed and become, some might speculate, bigger than cannabis, per our friend Bo Whitney.
Yeah, the numbers are staggering, but remember, it is still the same plant. Just there's a legal distinction between the plant, which just has to do with the Delta-9 THC content. That was really the motivation behind it, was to allow farmers to plant on a large scale more cannabis. That was the intention behind
It's
it.
exactly what it says in statute.
It just
Literally.
has a different ratio than the marijuana that's typically grown indoors in the regulated closed loop system, although it's grown outdoors in many states across the country, and some of that cannabis is even higher quality, of course. But at the end of the day, economics drives these decisions. Economics drives public policy, and how we've seen this evolve as well as, I kind of, tongue-in-cheek have called it red state weed in a certain respect, right? Because you look at different states where there aren't dispensary systems, and just if you look at a map and you look at red, blue, and purple states, they tend to fall into the red states. It just so happens to be that way. But that notion is actually taking shape where Republican politicians are embracing the hemp plant, because for better or for worse, it doesn't have that much stigma associated with it, whereas marijuana does and always will, even with recent changes or potential changes in treatment towards that plant.
I think that's interesting that you mentioned, something of that attenuating policy shift, right? Because I think the reefer madness mentality or this prohibitionist mentality that we've seen historically, whether it be war on drugs or whatever you want to call it, I think that, has been alive and well for quite some time. And, despite marijuana becoming, medically available in a number of different states across the country, unless there's anecdotal experiences with it, my aunt used it for chemo, or I used it when I was dealing with, PTSD, whatever the case may be, people aren't really willing to cross over that line. Now, when you have, hemp, and when you have, CBD, or you have these other things that are now available and federally legal, you are starting to see that policy shift, and that prohibitionist mentality is starting to fall by the wayside. And even, certain stronghold states that have been, very anti-marijuana for quite some time, are starting to recognize the value in regulating these products, providing consumers access to, what they need or what the market is demanding, while balancing that very important aspect of consumer safety. And so these Republican strongholds are starting to, seed the way to small business, to realize that, innovation is the answer, and allowing people to continue down that path while not necessarily going all in on marijuana, is still giving people access to what they want or what they, in some instances, need or rely upon for this functional relief. It's been quite fascinating to watch, and Bob, you and I have been doing this together for the last 13, 14 years, and it's changed. It's come a long way, and it's a very fun time to be a part of it. It's a very fun time to be alive, and it's just fascinating to see kind of the sea change, that has happened, as you have said, from red to purple to blue or everywhere in between, and it's been one heck of a ride.
It's definitely a ride, but Bret, we talk about how we got here. We're talking about legal and policy changes. You're in the trenches, right? You've been in the trenches working with CBD. What was it that you saw that sort of got us and got you to the point where you saw that? When did you see the consumer behavior change coupled with the innovation that Philip was just talking about?
Well, my story is one of my friends developed CBN, and the pathway, CBD, Delta 8 to CBN, for people who don't know. You can go through Delta 9 too, but at the time, Delta 8 made more sense because it's federally legal and whatnot. So I personally tried CBN, and it worked, knocked me out, went to sleep. So that's when I had the realization that, this is what CBD was crumbling, right? So, CBD was going down 14% month over month, and that compounds damn quickly. So, that's when I saw it, and then right behind it was Delta 8, and this was February 2020. Just shout out to Justin Journay, 3Chi, and Russell Lombard at Canna Redux. They were essentially the pioneers that scaled it up first, and then once we saw Delta 8 come out, we saw the purity, the cleanliness of the process, and we knew that it was going to be big. And it took a little time. I officially got in October of 2020, and things just skyrocketed. So, we went from doing a couple 100 kilos a month to thousands immediately within 90, 120 days. So the consumer demand was just there, 9 months, but essentially effective. I mean, it went like that. So, that's how I got here, and that's how MC Nutraceuticals was founded. And we took those science findings and the money that we made and continued to explore further down in the plant. THCV again, CBC, CBG has been a great cannabinoid too, and then down the chain to 46 of them. So, the derivatives part and the isomer part of the federal language is how it got here. And with that brought in funds that allowed for science and exploration of the plant, which again, a lot of this was already done. So, there's studies from the 50s and the 40s and the 60s, for example, showing how to make Delta 8. Delta 8 was researched before Delta 9 was. And then, with that comes the safety profile of it, which, Delta 8 has a lower LD50 than Delta 9 does. So, with this, we were able to kind of piece it all together, but it was, 80 years of research and trial and error and safety testing and all the things alike. And here we are with an array of cannabinoids that allows people to do custom formulations for what they think the consumer needs. And, we're a part of that, but we're not as close to the consumer as the 800, 900 brands that we service. But we get the data back, and then we get to decide, like, hey, you need 20% CBN here, 20% THCV there, and we kind of collect the data from the top level. But that's how the industry got here. Is Delta 8 is one milder than Delta 9. So from a consumer perspective, someone that might not have liked Delta 9 or tried it back in the 70s or the 80s, that might have been older, goes to the gas station, goes, what's this thing? Tries it, falls in love immediately. And that's how it skyrocketed so quickly. I mean, not many consumer packaged goods go in 9 months from, zero to billions of dollars, essentially. I mean, that's really what happened. And that created this industry. And, after that, people like I had to come into the trenches and, put some regulations in place in Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama, working on South and North Carolina with Philip, Florida, etc. And, the reality is we want this stuff 21 plus. We want reasonable milligram requirements, and we want people to be able to access the plant, and that's it. And if you are against accessing the plant, then you really don't like cannabis. You're not pro-cannabis. So if you want to put onerous restrictions on the plant, I don't believe you're supporting cannabis. Usually there's a monopoly behind that.
Well, and part of that, I think, is because, what we see as an industry began as a movement, right? And when you have a movement, it necessarily brings feelings, and those people are wed to the outcome. And I say those people, in a sense, we're all those people.
Right.
But my point is, the people that have worked for decades and decades to free the plant, so to speak, to bring legalization to the table, they have an outcome in mind, and that can be challenging. But when that movement actually becomes an industry, it changes. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, it's just a fact, right? You've got this notion that what I think you saw was cannabinoids from the plant, like every other plant that's used as a commodity, those cannabinoids, those terpenes, etc., they become an ingredient.
Correct.
Cannabinoids are mere ingredients in the broader marketplace, but that doesn't always sit well.
No, it doesn't sit well, and we all know this because we have these conversations all the time. We have lots of clients in marijuana here, and we get to have these conversations because we all been doing this for some time. You guys longer than me, but we see this. Oh, it needs to be called adult use. It'd be 10 milligrams. Who came up with that? 13 years ago, 14 years ago? That was great for progression, but we need to keep progressing. We need to keep allowing people that have medicinal needs, if you will, to have 50 milligrams, 100 milligrams. So I know people that have severe illnesses that need 800 just to function, to get out of bed. So, the notion that someone needs to spend $800 a day for their medicine is just absolutely absurd, and that's what the hemp industry's also done, is the people that do need 100 or 200 milligrams, hey, you can actually do it and afford it because you're not using insurance, clearly. We know that. And if you don't think that way, I strongly urge you to rethink that, because it is prohibitive, and it isn't grounded in any reason or science or even economic benefit, and it's definitely not for the consumer, because that's who gets hurt the most. When you put over-restrictive policy in place, the only person it hurts more than really the business owners is the consumer.
When you put confines and say, this is the way you're supposed to consume it, this is the way it's supposed to be, this is the outcome that's predetermined.
The reality is we don't know either. I mean, we're still working on this plan.
Well, and I think, if you're trying to put something that is reasonably speaking a moving target, if you're trying to put that into a box, it's never going to work. And I think when you start talking about regulatory capture, telling people how to do something, when to do it, whether that be a time, place, and manner restriction or whatever the case may be, people automatically are going to do it a different way. No different than, alcohol prohibition, led to bootlegging, marijuana prohibition led
Life finds
to,
a way.
Yeah, life finds a way. Marijuana prohibition led to the, proliferation of the legacy market, and we still see that, in states that have shut down, hemp markets, the e-commerce sales from out-of-state hemp companies that are selling these products into those markets, just continues to go through the roof. And, with that idea being, banning these things outright, we're going to protect consumers. At the end of the day, what you're ultimately doing is, forcing them into a market that is unregulated, in a market that, doesn't necessarily have testing standards behind it, doesn't necessarily do anything to promote consumer safety. People will find access to these products. And, there's always been the argument that marijuana is a gateway drug. Well, quite frankly, I've always been a believer that, it's not marijuana that's the gateway drug. It's the person that you're getting it from. And, if you go to that person to buy marijuana and, oh, hey, I'm out of this, but I've got that, that's once you start finding yourself down a very slippery slope. So I think, the regulatory capture that states are after when it comes to these particular products, suffers from a very bad PR spin that is likely pushed and, spoon-fed down their throats by large marijuana companies that are decrying hemp for lack of safety or testing or anything that, may be related to that. But, once you're trying to ban these products, and that attempt at regulatory capture is not real, because all you're doing is forcing people either back into the legacy market, into e-commerce, into places where they can't trust what they're buying. And so that's why I think the appropriate way to, and I don't even want to use the word handle, I think the appropriate way to treat these products or these cannabinoids is to, try to understand them. No different than, the research that your company has benefited from, Brett. That's 80 years of research to get us to where this company is today. Not that we're building the airplane as we're flying it, but in a certain regard we are. More research needs to go into this to truly understand what should be banned and what shouldn't, or how things should be regulated, how they shouldn't. But simply banning things outright is a failed concept. Prohibition doesn't work.
We're seeing that most states that have accidentally banned stuff, Nevada is a perfect example, they accidentally banned CBN, THCV, CBC, CBGA, CBDA. They banned everything but Delta-9 and CBG and CBDV essentially, and they're gonna have to reverse that. The same going on with California with AB 45. There's starting to be, you talk about the PR is swinging quickly. As far as I can tell, a year ago, Delta-8 was the worst thing in the world. Now it is, maybe not. Delta-8's pretty great, actually. So, yesterday, Justin and Janae dropped a tox study where 500 milligrams, in a toxicology study, went into a rat, equivalent 500 milligrams of Delta-8. The rat was fine. It actually was determined that the rat lost weight, which is kind of funny, which is kind of weird. But, things like this are happening. Like, we are starting to do the research, and people are realizing that, man, we kind of messed up, and the policy is being reversed.
But starting to do the research on top of a baseline of solid regulations that do the things that we were talking about earlier: consumer protection, packaging, labeling, and ultimately, insisting that these products are only purchased by people of a certain age. So we don't want these things to slide into children's hands, right?
Correct. Yeah, and these things are made to, very high purity. We test everything that comes out of this facility. We have 3 HPLCs. We run 70 tests a day, and there is a right way to do it. And the reality is if it's pure, and this will be a hot take, but if it's pure Delta-8, it's safer than a cannabis extract. Just because your apple was grown doesn't mean you should eat all the apple seeds. So we don't know what's in these cannabis extracts, even though they're natural. I'd rather have a 99% Delta-8 and add in the terpenes that are pure, whether botanicals or cannabis terpenes, and again, tailor that effect together, than extract something out of the plant with propane or butane and say, here you go, I don't know what's in here. I don't think people really think about that.
So a few things to take away from that. First of all, you're telling me that the cannabis industry, and by that I mean in this particular instance, the hemp industry, is actually conducting toxicology research into its best-selling product to determine whether or not it's safe for human consumption and or the marketplace. They're doing that themselves.
That is correct. And it's been deemed to be overly safe.
So, in the interest of policing itself, compounded with the fact that one of the most well-known testing labs for cannabis in the entire world, the first sample of Delta-8 that they ever received came from a pharmaceutical company, because Delta-8 is a much more stable molecule than Delta-9. Added on to that is the fact that the other day when I was in a state legislator's office, someone was saying that an organic product that was tested from a certain western state came back to be shown to be containing a litany of pesticides. So you're telling me that self-regulation, self-policing, or certainly basing things on proper regulations in the interest of consumer safety, is something that, the hemp products industry is willing to do?
Yes, and am I also saying the marijuana industry really screwed it up? Absolutely.
Well, but because of the prohibitive cost and because of
Correct.
280E and all of these other things.
None of these guys make any money, so how would they be able to invest
so
in the
challenging,
science?
to
You
your
can't.
point.
You can't. It's impossible.
You only do what's required of you under the compliance regulations in terms of testing on the marijuana sector side, the closed loop side. But it's a misnomer that this side of the industry is not regulated.
You tell me how many companies that are over 50 million in revenue in the marijuana industry are complying with the 280E tax code. You could probably do it on a couple hands, is my guess, or at least have even cash to pay it, because most of them just don't even pay it. So usually the forecasts that I see are how many quarters can they afford a 280E tax code? That doesn't even mean they're going to pay it.
It's
So
an unfunded future liability, Philip.
and then the $3.8 billion that's delinquent on top of that, it's not going to happen from the marijuana side. So yeah, me and the hemp people, we have no problems funding it because one, it's not going to come from universities unless you pay them, so that's fine. It's not going to come from the FDA, and nor do we probably even want that. So we, and when I say we, I mean American Healthy Alternatives Association and people that we work with at the association level, we got no problems funding these things because it's the right thing to do. And if we need to do that to defend our freedom to sell the cannabinoids, then it's a no-brainer. Because, MC Nutraceuticals sold 72,000 kilos of cannabinoids last year. Did we have any occurrences ever of any issues? Absolutely not. So how can you tell me that there's any issues with the product? Then couple that with all of our competitors, which we might have a 3 to 5% market share. There's also a study that says that 40 million Americans tried Delta-8. Tell me where the issues are. So 40 million Americans tried Delta-8. We've done tox studies in rats at mega doses. And, MC Nutraceuticals, makes 99% pure products. So tell me where the issue is. Logically.
The most effective clinical trial of all?
Yes, you could say that because it's a bigger population base.
Yeah.
So absolutely. So, that's 10% of the population of the United States of America that have consumed Delta-8. So every 1 in 10 people have tried Delta-8.
It's not a number to sneeze at.
No, it's not.
You mentioned 280E, and it got me thinking about some recent news, of course, that's out there. Schedule 3. The Schedule 3 leak, which became a press-worthy event. Obviously, it's big news in the cannabis industry as a whole. But, as I begin to think about this, it's believed that Schedule 3 really only affects the marijuana sector, and the Farm Bill only affects the hemp sector. Again, all of this is the cannabis industry. We're talking about cannabinoids as ingredients and so forth and so on. But how do these things fit together? Obviously, Schedule 3, it moves forward, gets rid of the 280E issue on the marijuana sector side. But if you're moving it towards a Schedule 3, doesn't that mean that anyone in the marijuana sector has to start acting and complying with very onerous supply chain requirements for a medical product company or a medical compound company? And I'm not aware of too many companies, and I've worked deep in the marijuana space for decades now, or at least a couple of decades. I'm not aware of any companies that really can with a straight face say that they would be able to comply with that.
So let me talk about the short to medium term effects, and you guys talk about the long term because you're the attorneys. But the reality is stock flips, capital markets, they like it, right? So rescheduling 3 is good for money, essentially, especially because 280E right there, you blip up whatever 30-40%, whatever it is. So you just made more money. So that's what rescheduling happens with. Now, the reality of the situation is it's not a regression by any means, but you're right. It does go essentially to the FDA, and technically there's requirements for that. Schedule 3 is Suboxone, Tylenol's in there, which is I guess less onerous. So there's a hodgepodge of different drugs that are in Schedule 3. So we could see a Tylenol model, but you don't want a Suboxone model, obviously. So with that, it's not the news that everyone thinks it is, as we know, and we talk freely. There's a procedural process that's going to take 180 days, best case scenario, if not years. So there's a reality to the situation, which is the DEA rescheduling is not happening tomorrow. The stock pops are not real. They will go back down. And with that, we'll see the end in mind, which is people are going to continue to go back to hemp. Once the news cycle ends, which will be in a week or 2 from now, you'll see people start talking about hemp again because, the reality is everyone except for 4 or 5 MSOs are in hemp, so they'll go back to focusing on that.
And Philip, it feels though that the Schedule 3 designation kind of eliminates adult use cannabis.
Well, it's interesting because, between the two of you, you mentioned, a 3-letter acronym that everybody's afraid of, right? The FDA. And, having to operate under the purview of the FDA, certainly creates a certain list or a certain series of hurdles that you have to jump over. And I'm not saying that one doesn't get higher than the next, but they're certainly significant. and having to operate under those medical guidelines, having to be subject or under the purview of the FDA, all but eliminates the adult use marijuana market entirely. And there's no certainty whatsoever that the federal government would make it easier to jump over those hurdles should it move to a Schedule III substance, or release more medical licenses to make this new medical marijuana market more publicly available. You're still going to have to deal with the doctor's recommendation for a qualifying condition, which in a lot of instances you would hope would become unfortunately chronic pain, because that typically ends up being the catch-all for a qualifying condition in a state's medical marijuana market. And realistically speaking, chronic pain is, this is no offense to anybody that suffers from it, but it's relatively hard to prove. And I think what you have with forcing people into a medical classification, also being put on a list, things like that, you're trying to force them into this chronic pain bucket, perhaps, when realistically that functional relief is already available with a lot of these derivatives and these hemp-based products.
And guess what? Those are descheduled. They're not subject to medical requirements from a supply chain standpoint.
Well, and realistically speaking, we don't necessarily need the PR. That comes from moving from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3.
And we don't need a blip in the capital markets because we're all cash flow positive.
And we pay our taxes.
And we pay our taxes, yes, that's correct.
But at the end of the day, it would, create, certainly a problem for recreational or adult use marijuana companies, because they would be forced back into that medical market. And, having worked in the cannabis industry for quite some time and closely with a lot of medical, whether that be medical or adult use marijuana businesses, there's not more than a handful that I can think of that would be able to meet all of those requirements. So I think what you really would be doing, unintentionally, is creating significant barriers to entry for the medical marijuana participants, and all but encouraging the hemp derivative market to continue to thrive, because that's where a lot of people would find themselves ending up in the first place. So I think that what we've seen this week with the DEA rescheduling announcement, whether you want to call it a market blip or something that's going to benefit or inflate stock prices artificially for a short amount of time, it also could be very political. We're finding ourselves in the middle of an election year, and we all know that young voters only turn out primarily during presidential election cycles. And this is, quite frankly, I would say probably top 2 polarizing issues within the country right now as far as young voting populations go. So maybe it's just an effort to see what kind of political bounce they can get out of this announcement. Maybe it is something that can be used on the campaign trail, in the next few months. But what I really think is that, the devil's, always in the details, and people don't necessarily realize what this realistically could do, to the marijuana market, but then unintentionally the realistic boom to the hemp derivatives market as well, Bob.
Yeah, I think it's a net positive for us. I think it's really unfortunate how short-sighted the media can be and not really understanding certain government agencies' processes behind rescheduling something, for example. I guess, we ask why are we here, and that's why we're here, just to educate people on, for example, DEA rescheduling, or the Farm Bill, or the hemp market, or even the marijuana cannabis market. So, why are we here? And that's the answer is there's a lot of misinformation out there, as we all know nowadays, and we have to be here as kind of a sort of truth to say, hey guys, cut it out. The DEA process could take years, and it's unfortunate. And I wish it was just descheduled, to be clear. And it should be descheduled, just like the hemp cannabinoids are. So Delta 9 should be descheduled. To be specific, that's what we need. So we don't need rescheduling. We need descheduling, and it's going to take someone, in our government to force that with an executive order, if that's procedurally correct. I'll let you guys speak on that, but someone eventually is just going to have to deschedule the Delta 9. But until then, the 4,600, we sell 46, but the hundreds of hemp-derived cannabinoids will be free to reign, and, that's fine by me too.
I mean, by and large, you need Congress to deschedule something. It needs to be a political decision. The recommendation that came from HHS said reschedule it. They could have said, there's no issues with this, we don't think it should be scheduled at all. That was highly unlikely, but that's not what they did in their 260-plus page report. So ultimately, it requires a political solution. Does this move the needle to Schedule III designation or movement? Sure it does. And will that create political will? But I believe, just like alcohol and tobacco, which were expressly descheduled, why were alcohol and tobacco descheduled? Why are they not controlled substances? Because the largest interest in the country at the time owned those companies. That cannot be said for marijuana sector businesses right now.
Pharmaceutical companies don't own them yet.
Correct. Or Philip Morris.
Or alcohol, right.
Who
right.
knows where it goes. But those companies have an option, another option,
Well,
and that's a current hemp-derived product line.
And unfortunately, I was just thinking about this, these companies also have analysts that do 5, 10, 15, 25-year projections, and this is in there. They're in no rush. What rush would Philip Morris be in, or Anheuser-Busch, or Pfizer? They're in no rush. So, they don't care what happened in the news yesterday. They already have a plan. So you'd be a fool to think that there's not a plan behind one of these special interest groups that like to buy things off the shelf and either shelve them or deploy them using their resources and make a bunch of money. They don't care if it's 50 billion, 5 billion, or 50 million. It doesn't matter to them. It's all a rounding error at the end of the day. Maybe not 50 billion, but the rest of the numbers are fairly rounding errors, and they'll just buy it. That's what they do. They're conglomerates. They're hedge funds.
Well, I think it's interesting when you consider who would stand to lose the most if marijuana were to be completely descheduled, let's say. Would it be big alcohol, big tobacco, big pharma?
All three.
So, given the relative clout that those interest groups have, whether it be in your local state house or on the Hill in Washington, D.C., it might make sense that this is just nothing more than an announcement that there are far bigger political machinations at play, and those three organizations or 10 bodies, let's just say, might not want this to happen, and very well might have their thumbs on the scales as far as the timing of this when this actually does come to play.
I think it's those three. They're watching and waiting, but right now there's a fragmentation, obviously, to marijuana versus hemp, and they're just sitting back, collecting the data, looking at the numbers, and realizing, the pharma companies are realizing they can't do anything until, for cannabis, until 280E is removed, because that's a tax for selling drugs illegally, right? That's essentially what it is. And then now, on the hemp side, you see alcohol approaching very quickly. So you can kind of look back and say, okay, alcohol's entering hemp quickly. There's maybe a roadmap for pharma to enter marijuana, and then tobacco's not really involved, but they got a electric nicotine problem. So you see them fighting that battle instead of interfering with us. So they're all three involved in something closely related.
Make no mistake, they've all been involved in this industry for years now, just on a under the table,
watching with
low-scale
Constellation
kind of
Brands,
way.
right?
Yes.
You give them 50 million, and again, not a rounding error, but that way you're involved, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but alcohol, it seems like alcohol is the first mover heavy, because they're actually using internal resources to distribute brands across the country, and then they'll start once we probably see the farm bill, assuming it gets reauthorized or extended another year, you'll start to see acquisitions in 2025 for sure.
But guess who's going to preserve the status quo in the Farm Bill? The alcohol distribution industry.
Absolutely.
Because they see that the sale of spirits, beer, wine is down significantly. Consumers are changing things and changing
They
their
don't have to
preferences.
wait on the DEA to, who knows? You can't lobby the DEA, so you shouldn't. So who knows, what's gonna happen with that. And, we saw the agendas, as we wrap this up, we saw the agendas of the Farm Bill. Nothing about intoxicating hemp, that's curious, isn't it? So, you know, everyone thought this was a loophole. If this was such a loophole, don't you think Congress would probably try to cover their ass and say, hey, we messed up, let's fix it? There's no interest in the quote-unquote loophole. If it was a loophole in 2018, it's not anymore. And that's clear with the agendas that came out this week.
I think that certainly leaves a lot of food for thought and, you know, much more to be discussed. You know, maybe the next time we all get together for what's gonna happen with the 2024 Farm Bill.
And the last thing I would say is, I believe the easiest vote to get on Capitol Hill in Washington DC is a status quo vote. And that is where things continue on the same path as today.
The next episode is where are we going? Why are we here and where are we going? Thank you guys for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.